So we return now to the revolution in military affairs, and on the basis of some of the things that we've explored in regard to the nature of technology, we can perhaps conduct a critical appraisal of the claims made under the banner of the revolution in military affairs, or the RMA for short. In one of its post-millennial incarnations, the revolution in military affairs became known as network-centric warfare, and the Pentagon at the time, led by Donald Rumsfeld, adopted an agenda of transformation. Again, this idea that everything was going to be overhauled, perhaps continuously overhauled by information technology, that a new global information grid would ascend, and that new forms of military power were going to be unlocked as a consequence. Network-centric warfare has since fallen out of favor because of the general debacle of the Iraq War, but these ideas continue to persist. And so the dream of lifting the fog of war is indeed an enduring one. An idea that technology is the panacea, or will solve the challenges of military power. So, how should we query this notion of a fog of war that is to be lifted through information technology? Well, we might interrogate this claim by going back to Clausewitz himself and see what Clausewitz actually had to say about the fog of war. The fog of war is not a phrase that we actually find in that form within On War, but he does, of course, say quite a bit about information. And in one of the most telling passages, he states that a great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory, a still greater part is false, and by far the greatest part is of doubtful character. Now, when we look at that claim, we realize that there is perhaps here a problem with the conception of information that is most prevalent within the thinking of proponents of the revolution in military affairs, which is that uncertainty is not necessarily caused by gaps in information, by the absence of information. I mean, some shape or form it will be, yes. But perhaps more fundamental is the lack of comprehension of the information, or the false interpretation of the information that has been acquired. Again, Clausewitz tells us information is contradictory. Some of it is false. Some of it is of doubtful character. It seems, in fact, quite likely that as we collect more and more information, we are not going to be only collecting good information or information that is beyond suspicion. We'll in fact collect information that is in contradiction, or that might simply be false. And in fact, we can know for a certainty that some of it will be false, because some of it will be false by design. It will be the outcome of the deception or deceptive moves of the adversary. The adversary will deliberately try to generate fake information, fake news if you want. So information technology in itself will not allow us to distinguish good from bad information, or at least that is a decision that still has to be made, and will in all likelihood have to be made by human actors with their fallibilities. In fact, one could even go further and suggest that information technology might be its own source of a fog of war. Again, partly induced through informational overload, and perhaps partly induced through the maneuvers of the adversary. A further problem with a kind of information dependence, the idea that the key to war is to collect more and more information, and to therefore organize our militaries around information infrastructures, it is that these infrastructures will of course become, in the Clausewitzian formula, the center of gravity. They will become the most vulnerable element of the military infrastructure, and therefore attractive targets. If you want to take out a military that is built around information networks, then you target the information networks. And you might do this through hacking, or through electromagnetic pulses that can be caused by nuclear bursts, which can deactivate electronic components. There's a whole ways in which we could imagine doing so. We've seen that Chinese have tested anti-satellite weapon systems, which could be one of the means by which to do so. So the question becomes whether in fact such militaries, information-dependent militaries, would be able to fight if they lose access to that information. So any dependency on a particular technology or particular infrastructure for power is also, in a sense, creating a new vulnerability. Finally, there's good reason to think that war remains, in a Clausewitzian model, a clash of wills. One of the tendencies within the RMA doctrine is for the enemy to disappear from view. A tendency to see the enemy as merely a mirror image of the US military. This was, of course, one of the problems that arose with in the 2000s for the US military when it advanced with its network-centric warfare model. The network-centric warfare doctrine saw as its enemy an industrial era military, so something out of the Cold War, like the Russians or the Chinese. And of course, from that perspective, that the US could move on to the information age, it would naturally be superior. It would do everything better than those state militaries. But of course, what the US found in Iraq is, indeed, it could very quickly defeat the Iraqi army, but then it struggled to cope against a fairly low-tech, distributed, networked insurgency. And it found the same problems in Afghanistan as well. So there was a lack of a recognition of the interaction in war, that you don't always face the adversaries you want to face, and that your adversaries are resourceful and will not necessarily play by the rules by which you will win. They will try to change the rules, or they will play by those rules that put you at a disadvantage. So that strategic and tactical interaction can negate particular advantages. This is the very notion of asymmetric, or the principle of asymmetric warfare. Finally, the greater destructive and killing power is not a guarantee of victory if there is a willingness to suffer casualties that is greater on the so-called weaker side. And the Vietnam War showed this. The United States never lost a battle and lost far less men than the Vietnamese did, but the Vietnamese were simply willing to suffer and to lose a far greater degree of their fighters and their civilian populations than the Americans were. And so in the end, while the US was not defeated on the battlefield, it nonetheless lost the war because it lost the will to fight the war. So I think it's important to recognize what the RMA really stands for. It is, of course, in a sense, capturing something that is correct, which is to say that information technology is playing a growing role in warfare today, and that it seems impossible to try to wage war without it today. But on the other hand, the extravagant claims made about it, the almost messianic tone in which it is advocated as a solution to military problems, is in fact revealing of something else. And I think Jeremy Black here gives us a nice summation. Belief in the RMA, he says, is symptomatic of a set of cultural and political assumptions that tell us more about Western society than they do about any objective assessment of military options. The RMA acts as a nexus for a range of developments and beliefs, including an unwillingness to accept conscription, a very low threshold for casualties, an assertion of Western superiority, and the ideology of mechanism. So here, again, we can see the key aspects, right? We have Western militaries which do not want conscription. That is to say, they don't want to use very large numbers of soldiers. One of the reasons for this is their low threshold for casualties. We've talked about casualty aversion many times. There is a desire to continue to assert Western superiority, which is to say there's a desire to continue to project military force internationally. And there are these constraints, how to continue to exert power and yet without the kind of blood sacrifice that it might entail. And the fix is generally seen as technological. Technology is going to be the way to square that circle. And of course, this will lead very logically to what we will discuss in the coming weeks, which is the development of drones and autonomous weapon systems. Drones and autonomous weapon systems are another way to continue to project force externally without having to expose Western forces to danger. Whether that will in fact be any more successful in delivering the kinds of foreign policy outcomes that Western states want certainly remains to be seen. So, by way of conclusion, one could say that technology obviously does matter in war. And information technology is most likely indeed transforming the practice of war, although not in the definitive or certain ways that RMA proponents would like. But it is important to realize that technology is both more and less than we typically think it is. It is less than we think it is because it is not an external material agency that unilaterally transforms a passive social body. So the technological determinist thesis, if you want. But it is also more than we think it is, because it in fact permeates every aspect of the social. All our social relations, virtually, are mediated by technology in the widest possible sense. The buildings we inhabit, the objects that surround us, the very mundane technical objects that make social life possible, certainly in the kinds of complex societies that we inhabit. So we need, I think, a much kind of more capacious conception of technology, and also to shy away from any strict or too neat a division between the realm of the social and the technological. Finally, I want to enjoin you to think more seriously about technology, because just as war is too serious a matter to entrust to military men, as the French statesman Georges Clemenceau once put it, one would have to follow Wilhelm Flusser in his notion that technology has simply become too serious a matter to be left to technicians. That it is the responsibility of all of us, as informed, as educated citizens, to apprehend, understand, and critique technology as seriously as we can.